Welcome. You are listening to First Beliefs, a podcast dedicated to exploring the ancient wisdom, spiritual traditions, and sacred knowledge that have shaped the human story since the very beginning of recorded thought. Whether you have come here tonight to learn, to reflect, or simply to let the quiet voice of history carry you gently into rest, you have found the right place. Here, we do not rush. We sit with ideas the way our ancestors once sat around fires, slowly, carefully, allowing the warmth of all truths to reach into the present moment. Tonight, we are going somewhere extraordinary. We are going back, further back than most people ever dare to look, to the very origins of human morality. Not morality as handed down from a pulpit, not morality inscribed in a holy book, but morality as it first flickered into being in the animal mind, in the prehistoric gut, in the earliest stirrings of what it means to live alongside another living being and feel instinctively, viscerally, undeniably that something is not fair. This episode is about the first written law, morality before religion. And across our time together tonight, we are going to move through 4 profound territories. We will begin by asking a question that philosophers have wrestled with for thousands of years. Did morality come before religion, or did religion invent morality? Then we will descend into a laboratory in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States of America, where a Capuchin monkey changed everything we thought we knew about the evolutionary roots of justice. From there, we will travel to the ancient river civilizations of Mesopotamia to read 2 of the oldest law codes ever written, Hammurabi and Ur-Nammu, and ask whether ancient people believed in revenge or in restoration. And finally, we will sail down the Nile River to ancient Egypt, where the dead were judged not by their words or their wealth, but by the literal weight of their hearts. This is a long and beautiful journey. Pour yourself something warm. Settle in. And if at any point the rhythm of history lulls you into sleep, that too is a gift. Let us begin. But first, a gentle request. If this podcast brings you something of value, a new idea, a moment of peace, a question that lingers in your mind the following morning, please take a moment to subscribe to First Beliefs on YouTube. Leave a comment telling us what ancient tradition or wisdom you would most like to explore next. Your voice shapes this community, and if this episode moves you, share it with someone who asks big questions. Every subscriber, every like, every comment helps this space grow, and every new listener is another person choosing to slow down and look at the deep roots of what makes us human. Now, let us go back to the very beginning. Part 1. Did morality come before religion? There is an old argument, ancient in its own right, that goes something like this. Without God, there is no goodness. Without divine law, there is no moral law. Without religion, human beings would descend into chaos, cruelty, and selfishness, governed only by appetite and fear. This argument has been made by philosophers, by priests, by emperors, and by ordinary people sitting around kitchen tables. It has a certain internal logic. If morality is a set of rules about how we ought to behave, then surely those rules must come from somewhere, and if not from a higher power, then from where? But here is the question that keeps pulling at the thread. What if morality did not come from religion at all? What if morality is older than any god that humans have ever named? What if the sense of fairness, the instinct for compassion, the rage at injustice, what if these feelings did not arrive in the human heart because a divine being placed them there, but because millions of years of living in groups, depending on one another, protecting one another, and being betrayed by one another, shaped those instincts into us the way a river shapes stone? This is not a new idea. The ancient Greek philosopher Plato asked the version of it in his dialogue called Euthyphro, written around 399 BCE. Plato's question, posed through the voice of Socrates, goes roughly like this: is something good because the gods command it, or do the gods command it because it is good? This question, known today as the Euthyphro dilemma, cuts right to the heart of the relationship between morality and the divine. If something is only good because God says so, then morality is arbitrary. God could theoretically command cruelty and it would become good. But if God commands things because they are already good, then goodness exists independently of God, and religion is simply pointing toward a moral truth that pre-existed any divine declaration. For most of Western history, this dilemma was treated as a theological puzzle, interesting but ultimately resolvable through faith. The assumption remained that however morality worked, human beings had access to it only through divine revelation. Without scripture, without sacred tradition, without the authority of a god, morality would have no foundation. But then something happened in the 20th century that began to shift the conversation entirely. Scientists, biologists, evolutionary theorists, primatologists, and neuroscientists started looking at morality not as a philosophical or theological question, but as a biological one. And what they found was stunning. They found moral behavior in animals, not metaphorical moral behavior, not anthropomorphic projection, but actual, observable, measurable behavior in non-human species that looks, by any reasonable definition, like fairness, empathy, cooperation, and even punishment of cheaters. They found it in chimpanzees, in bonobos, in elephants, in wolves, in dolphins, in ravens, and in small, quick-eyed monkeys called capuchins. And the discovery that made headlines around the world, the one that cracked open the debate about the origins of morality like a stone splitting in frost, happened in a modest laboratory with a small cage, 2 monkeys, and a grape. But before we get to the grape experiment, let us take a moment to sit with the deeper question this evidence raises. If morality exists in some form in species that have no religion, no scripture, no deity, no concept of the divine, what does that tell us? It tells us, at minimum, that the seeds of morality do not require a theological soil to sprout. It suggests that certain moral instincts, fairness, reciprocity, the expectation of equitable treatment, the rejection of exploitation, may be evolutionary adaptations. They may be features of the social animal, shaped by natural selection because groups that practice cooperation, fairness, and trust survived better and reproduced more successfully than groups that did not. This does not mean religion has no role in morality. Far from it. What it means is that the story is far more ancient and far more interesting than we were taught. Religion, in this view, did not invent morality. Religion discovered, systematized, sanctified, and transmitted moral instincts that evolution had already placed in the bodies and minds of social animals, including us. Think about what that means for a moment. The golden rule, treat others as you wish to be treated, appears in some form in virtually every major religious tradition on earth. It appears in the ancient Egyptian texts of Ma'at. It appears in the Vedic traditions of ancient India. It appears in the teachings of Confucius, in the Sermon on the Mount, in the Talmud, in the Quran, in the words of the Buddha. Scholars have long noted this convergence and pointed to it as evidence of universal divine truth. But evolutionary biologists point to the same convergence and see something different, not proof that all these traditions receive the same divine message, but proof that all these traditions were giving articulate voice to the same deep biological instinct. The instinct for reciprocity, the drive toward fairness, the social glue that holds groups together across time. So, which is it? Is the golden rule a divine commandment or a biological imperative? Before we answer that, let us trace the golden rule a little more carefully. In the Jewish tradition, the Rabbi Hillel, who lived roughly from 70 BCE to 10 CE, was once challenged by a skeptic who asked him to teach the entire Torah while standing on one foot. Hillel's reply was immediate and elegant. That which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. That is the whole Torah. The rest is the explanation. Go and learn it. Here is the golden rule in one of its most condensed forms. The negative version, sometimes called the silver rule, which asks not that you actively do good to others, but that you at minimum refrain from doing to them what you would not want done to yourself. In the Analects of Confucius, compiled in the 4th or 5th century BCE, the master is asked a similar question. Is there one word which can serve as a rule of practice for all one's life? Confucius responds with a single word, reciprocity. What you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others. The same principle, a completely different cultural context. No shared sacred text, no shared tradition, no communication across the thousands of miles that separated ancient China from ancient Palestine. And yet the same deep moral intuition rising to the surface of consciousness and crystallizing into words. The Mahabharata, one of the great Sanskrit epics of ancient India, contains the line, one should never do to another what one regards as injurious to oneself. This, in brief, is the rule of righteousness. The Buddhist Dhammapada, compiled from the sayings of the Buddha, states, hurt not others in ways that you yourself would find hurtful. The Quran, revealed in 7th century Arabia, states, none of you truly believes until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself. And in the Christian tradition, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, so in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. 5 traditions. At minimum 5 independent articulations of the same principle. each expressed in the language of its own cultural context, wrapped in its own theological framework, speaking to communities with different histories, different cosmologies, different practices, and rituals. And yet, underneath all that difference, the same bedrock instruction: what you would not want done to you, do not do to others. Perhaps the most honest answer and the most profound is that this may be a false choice. Perhaps the reason the Golden Rule feels divine is precisely because it is so deeply embedded in what we are. Perhaps what religion recognizes as sacred is, in part, the oldest and most fundamental truth of our species. We are not solitary creatures. We are built for relationship. And anything that threatens the bonds of relationship, cruelty, exploitation, injustice, betrayal, triggers not just social consequences, but something that feels from the inside like a violation of something sacred. That feeling, that sense, that fairness is not just practical but moral, not just social but cosmic, may be the oldest spiritual experience available to the human animal. And it may be far older than any god we have ever given a name. Now let us go to the laboratory. Let us meet the monkey who changed everything. Part 2. The Capuchin Fairness Experiment: Morality in the Animal Mind. The year was 2003. The researchers were Dr. Franz de Waal and Dr. Sarah Brosnan, working together at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States of America. De Waal is one of the most celebrated primatologists in the world, a Dutch-born scientist who has spent decades studying the social behavior of great apes and other primates, and who has written extensively about what he calls the biological roots of morality. Brosnan was his doctoral student at the time, and together they designed an experiment so simple and so elegant that its results would ripple through philosophy, theology, economics, and evolutionary biology for decades. The subjects were Capuchin monkeys, small, nimble, highly social primates native to Central and South America. Capuchins are intelligent, curious, and deeply attuned to social dynamics within their groups. They form strong relationships, remember past interactions, and, as it turned out, notice very clearly when they are being treated unfairly. The experimental setup was straightforward. 2 capuchin monkeys were placed in adjacent cages, separated by a mesh divider so they could see each other clearly. Each monkey was trained to perform a simple task: hand a small granite pebble to a human researcher in exchange for a food reward. In the first condition, both monkeys received the same reward for completing the task: a piece of cucumber. Monkeys generally like cucumber. They would happily complete the task and eat their cucumber reward over and over again. No problems, no complaints. Then came the second condition. One monkey, the test subject, continued to receive cucumber for completing the task. But the other monkey sitting right there, visible through the mesh, began receiving a much better reward: a grape. Monkeys love grapes. Grapes are sweet, juicy, and highly preferred over cucumber. From a basic nutritional standpoint, the test subject was still receiving food. Nothing had been taken away. The cucumber was still a perfectly adequate reward for the pebble. And yet, the test monkey's reactions were immediate, visceral, and, to anyone watching, unmistakably furious. Some monkeys refused to hand over the pebble entirely. Some took the cucumber reward and threw it back at the researcher. Some threw the pebble out of the cage in apparent disgust. Many displayed visible signs of agitation, shaking the cage walls, vocalizing loudly, turning away from the researcher. In a significant number of trials, monkeys who had previously been perfectly happy to accept cucumber as a reward began refusing it outright the moment they saw their neighbor receiving a grape for the same work. Let us be very clear about what this means. These monkeys were not hungry. They were not in pain. The objective quality of their situation, receiving food in exchange for a task, had not changed. What had changed was the relative value of their reward compared to their neighbors. And that relative disparity, that violation of what we might call equality of treatment, produced a behavioral response that can only be described as protest. When de Waal and Brosnan published their findings in the journal Nature, the scientific community took notice. The study was titled "Monkeys Reject Unequal Pay," and the phrase lodged itself in the public imagination. Here were non-human primates, creatures with no religion, no legal system, no philosophical tradition, demonstrating what appeared to be a fundamental sensitivity to fairness, not just to their own well-being, but to the comparative well-being between themselves and others in their social group. The researchers were careful to note what they called inequity aversion, the technical term for the tendency to resist or protest outcomes that are perceived as unfair relative to a social partner. Inequity aversion had previously been described in human beings, and economists had long observed that humans will often sacrifice personal gain in order to punish perceived unfairness, a behavior that makes no logical sense in purely rational economic models, but makes profound sense if you understand humans as social animals with deep moral instincts. What de Waal and Brosnan had done was demonstrate that at least one form of inequity aversion exists in a non-human primate and therefore almost certainly predates the development of human culture, language, religion, or any other uniquely human institution. But there was more. In follow-up experiments and in related research across different primate species, the findings deepened. Chimpanzees showed even more complex responses. Some chimpanzees would not only protest receiving an inferior reward, but would also refuse to accept a superior reward when they knew their partner was receiving an inferior one, what researchers call advantageous inequity aversion. A chimpanzee offered a grape while its partner received cucumber might also refuse the grape in protest. This behavior, sacrificing personal gain out of fairness to a social partner, begins to look something very much like altruistic morality. It begins to look from the outside, like the conscious recognition that it is not right to benefit from another's disadvantage. Now, there are important cautions to keep in mind here. Scientists are appropriately careful about over-interpreting animal behavior. We cannot know from the inside what a capuchin monkey or a chimpanzee is experiencing. We cannot know whether they are having anything like what we would call a moral feeling a sense of rightness or wrongness, a sense of obligation, a conscience. What we can observe is behavior, and the behavior we observe is consistent with what we would expect if these animals did have something like a proto-moral sense, a built-in sensitivity to fairness in the context of social exchange. De Waal himself has written extensively about what he calls the moral emotions, the emotional substrates that underlie moral reasoning. Empathy, reciprocity, the sense of fairness, the impulse to help, the capacity for consolation, all of these exist in some form across a range of species. And in his view, human morality is not a departure from nature, but an elaboration of it. We did not receive morality from outside ourselves. We grew it the way we grew our hands and our eyes through millions of years of living together, depending on one another, and being shaped by the consequences of how we treated each other. It is worth slowing down on the concept of empathy here, because it is one of the most important pieces of the puzzle. Empathy, the capacity to feel something of what another being is feeling, to take their inner state into one's own inner experience, is not uniquely human. Frans de Waal and others have documented consolation behavior in chimpanzees, in which individuals who were not directly involved in a conflict will approach a distressed animal and offer physical contact, gentle touching, embracing, grooming behaviors that appear to serve the function of soothing. This is not just tolerance of another's distress. It is active responsiveness to it. It is the recognition that another being is suffering and the impulse to do something about that. Elephants have been observed returning repeatedly to the bones of deceased family members, touching the remains with their trunks in what observers cannot help but describe as a kind of reverence or grief. Bonobos, the great apes most closely related to humans, routinely use physical affection and sexual contact as a means of resolving conflict and maintaining social bonds, a strategy that appears to dramatically reduce the level of violence in their groups compared to chimpanzees. Dolphins have been documented supporting injured or ill companions, swimming beneath them to help keep them at the surface to breathe. Ravens, which are among the most cognitively sophisticated birds, have been observed consoling distressed flock members and have demonstrated a remarkably sophisticated understanding of fairness in experimental settings. None of this means that these animals have morality in the full philosophically rich sense that human beings mean when they use the word, but it does mean that the raw material of morality, the emotional building blocks of empathy, fairness, cooperation, and care, is far more widely distributed across the animal kingdom than anyone imagined just 50 years ago. And it means that the question of morality's origins cannot be answered by looking only at human culture, human religion, or human philosophy. The question has to go deeper. It has to go biological. It has to go evolutionary. And when we go that deep, we find something remarkable. The same forces that produced the Capuchin monkey's outrage at the cucumber also produced in our much more cognitively complex ancestors the capacity to name that outrage, to generalize it, to ask what it means, to build institutions around it, and eventually to carve it into stone. This is a deeply important idea, and it has implications that reach far beyond biology. If moral intuitions are evolutionary adaptations, ancient, embodied, pre-rational, then the great moral codes of human civilization are not the source of human morality, they are its reflection. The codes, whether carved in stone, written in scripture, or spoken by philosophers, did not create the sense of fairness. They recognized it, named it, organized it, and gave it institutional force. And nowhere in human history is this more visible than in the ancient river valley of Mesopotamia, in the land between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, where, roughly 4,000 years ago, two kings sat down and tried to write morality into law. Let us go to Mesopotamia. Let us read the oldest laws ever written. Part 3. Hammurabi versus Ur-Nammu, Revenge or Restitution? Close your eyes for a moment, or let them soften, let them rest, and try to imagine a world without written law. Not a world without rules. Every human society has always had rules. But imagine a world where the rules exist only in memory, in custom, in the authority of whoever happens to hold power at any given moment. Imagine a world where justice means whatever the king, the priest, or the local strongman decides it means on any given day. Where a wrong done to you has no fixed remedy, where the outcome of conflict depends entirely on your status, your family's power, your ability to fight or to bribe or to persuade. For most of human prehistory, this was the world. And then, in the fertile valleys of ancient Mesopotamia, a region we now call Iraq, in the heart of the Middle East, something changed. Something new came into being. Something so radical, so unprecedented, that its echoes can still be heard in every courtroom, every constitution, every legal system on earth today. Someone wrote the law down. And the moment law was written, something extraordinary happened. Law stopped being the exclusive possession of those who held power and began, at least potentially, to become something that could be held against power. A written law is, in some sense, a promise, not just to the governed, but to the governors themselves. It says, "This is what we have agreed. This is how things work." And it applies, or at least it claims to apply, to everyone. The two law codes we are going to look at tonight were written in ancient Mesopotamia, separated by roughly 300 years. They are among the oldest surviving legal texts in all of human history. And what is remarkable about them is not just that they are old, it is that they reveal in precise and concrete detail what the people of that time believed about the nature of justice. Not justice in the abstract, justice in the specific. What do you owe someone if you break their bone? What happens if you accuse a person of a crime and the accusation turns out to be false? If your ox gores a neighbor's slave, who pays and how much? These are not philosophical questions. These are the gritty, practical questions of people trying to live together, and the answers, written in clay, pressed with a reed stylus, baked hard under the sun, are a window into the moral imagination of our ancestors. The older of the two codes is the Code of Ur-Nammu. Ur-Nammu was the founder of the third dynasty of Ur in the ancient Sumerian civilization of southern Mesopotamia. He ruled from approximately 2112 BCE to 2095 BCE, making this code roughly 4,100 years old at the time of this recording. The Code of Ur-Nammu was written in Sumerian, one of the world's first written languages, on clay tablets. It was discovered in fragmentary form, and scholars have spent considerable effort reconstructing and translating what survives. What is immediately striking about the Code of Ur-Nammu, even in its fragmented state, is its prologue. Before the laws themselves are listed, Ur-Nammu spends considerable time establishing the context for why the laws exist. He presents himself not as a tyrant issuing decrees, but as a king who has been chosen by the gods, in particular by Nana, the moon god, and Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon, to bring equity and justice to the land. He claims that he has established fair weights and measures. He claims that he has abolished corruption. He claims that he has protected the widow, the orphan, and the poor man from the rich and powerful. The laws, in his framing, are not expressions of royal power, but expressions of divine and social obligation. Then come the laws themselves, and here is where things get philosophically fascinating. The Code of Ur-Nammu is, to a remarkable degree, a code of restitution rather than revenge. Consider some examples. If a man knocks out the eye of another man, a devastating injury in any age, the punishment under the Code of Ur-Nammu is not that his own eye be removed. It is that he pay 60 shekels of silver. If a man knocks out a tooth, again, the punishment is not reciprocal mutilation. It is 2 shekels of silver. If a man severs the foot of another man with a weapon, he pays 10 shekels. If a man strikes another man with a weapon and breaks his bone, he pays 1 mina of silver. Do you feel the logic here? These are payments, compensations. The underlying principle is not that justice requires the offender to experience the same pain they inflicted. The underlying principle is that justice requires the offender to repair, to the best of their ability, what they have damaged. The injury has diminished the victim economically, physically, socially. The law's response is to require the offender to provide material compensation that acknowledges the harm done and provides the victim with something, not their eye or their tooth back, obviously, but silver, which has real economic value and can help the victim navigate the consequences of their injury. This is a fundamentally restorative vision of justice, and it is, in important ways, a very sophisticated and humane one. The focus is not on satisfying a desire for revenge, a desire that may feel powerful, but does not actually restore what has been lost. The focus is on practical repair. Now, let us move forward roughly 300 years to another Mesopotamian civilization, another great city, another king, and a very different moral vision. Hammurabi was the 6th king of the first Babylonian dynasty, who ruled ancient Babylon from approximately 1792 BCE to 1750 BCE. The Code of Hammurabi was engraved on a massive stone stele, a large upright slab of black basalt about 2¼ meters tall, and set up in a public place in the city of Babylon so that anyone could read it. The stele was discovered in 1901 CE by French archaeologists excavating the ancient city of Susa in what is now southwestern Iran. It was found largely intact, and it is now one of the most famous objects in the Louvre Museum in Paris, France, where it has been on permanent display since 1902. The Code of Hammurabi contains 282 laws addressing an extraordinary range of topics: property rights, contracts, wages, marriage, divorce, adoption, inheritance, slavery, trade, and of course, criminal behavior, including violence, theft, and fraud. Like Ur-Nammu before him, Hammurabi presents himself in the prologue as a divinely appointed ruler whose laws are expressions of divine will, in his case, the will of Anu, the god of the sky, and Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon. He presents the laws as a gift to his people, and he claims, as Ur-Nammu did, that they are intended to protect the weak from the powerful, to ensure that justice reaches the widow and the orphan. But the content of Hammurabi's laws tells a different story, or at least a very different approach to the mechanics of justice. Because the Code of Hammurabi is famous, above all, for one principle, a principle so resonant that it has echoed through history all the way into modern language and moral philosophy. The principle is this: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. In Latin, this principle is called the lex talionis, the law of retribution. And in Hammurabi's code, it appears with striking literalness. Law 196. If a man puts out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. Law 197. If he breaks another man's bone, his bone shall be broken. Law 200. If a man knocks out the tooth of a man of his own rank, his tooth shall be knocked out. Where Ur-Nammu said pay 60 shekels of silver for an eye, Hammurabi said lose your own eye. Where Ur-Nammu demanded compensation, Hammurabi demanded equivalence. Where Ur-Nammu focused on repair, Hammurabi focused on mirror punishment. The justice system imagined in Hammurabi's code is one in which the scales of justice are balanced not by money but by suffering. The offender must experience precisely what the victim experienced, no more and no less. Now, we should be careful here not to caricature either code. Hammurabi's laws are actually considerably more nuanced than the lex talionis principle might suggest. Many of his 282 laws deal in fines and compensations, not in bodily retribution. And importantly, the lex talionis principle in Hammurabi's code is explicitly class-dependent. The eye for an eye rule applies only between social equals. If you are a noble and you injure a commoner, you pay silver. If you are a noble and you injure a slave, you pay the slave's owner. The talion in Hammurabi is not universal. It is tiered, stratified, calibrated to social hierarchy in ways that reveal the deep inequalities of Babylonian society. Similarly, Ur-Nammu's code, while restorative in its approach to physical injury, is not a paradise of universal equality. It also contains provisions that reflect the hierarchical and patriarchal structure of Sumerian society. The compensation for harm is not equal across all people. Slaves and free people are treated differently. Men and women are treated differently. But when we strip away the social context and look at the underlying moral logic, the contrast remains genuinely striking. And it poses a profound question: which approach to justice is more aligned with our deepest moral instincts? The lex talionis, an eye for an eye, has an intuitive, immediate power. It feels satisfying in a visceral way. If someone hurts you, they should be hurt. The scales should balance. Retribution feels just. And there is a long tradition, both philosophical and psychological, that argues this feeling is not merely primitive, but is in fact a foundational element of moral intuition. The sense that a wrong must be answered, that the wrongdoer must suffer some consequence equivalent to the harm they caused, is nearly universal across human cultures. It connects to the inequity aversion we saw in the Capuchin monkeys. Something in us feels that imbalance must be corrected. But there is another tradition, equally ancient, equally powerful, that says the goal of justice is not to balance suffering, but to repair harm, to restore what was broken, to make the victim whole, or as whole as possible. This tradition argues that retribution, however satisfying it may feel, does not actually accomplish anything useful. Knocking out the offender's tooth does not restore the victim's tooth. It creates two toothless people instead of one. It doubles the harm in the world rather than reducing it. These two visions, revenge and restitution, retribution and restoration, have been in conversation with each other throughout human history. They show up in legal systems, in religious traditions, in political debates about criminal justice, in personal decisions about how to respond when we are wronged. And they show up with remarkable clarity in these two ancient Mesopotamian law codes, one of them 300 years older than the other, separated by the rise and fall of dynasties, and yet both attempting, in their different ways, to answer the same ancient evolutionary question: how do we live together without destroying each other? Before we leave Mesopotamia and travel to Egypt, there is one more thing worth noting about these law codes, something that speaks directly to our opening question about morality and religion. Both Hammurabi and Ur-Nammu wrapped their legal codes in divine authority. Both present themselves as instruments of the gods, delivering divine justice to human society. And yet, the content of their laws, the actual rules about eyes and teeth and silver and compensation, is not specifically theological. It is not about worship. It is not about rituals or sacrifices or correct belief. It is about how human beings in a community should treat one another. It is about property, family, physical integrity, economic fairness. It is about the same things the Capuchin monkey was protesting in her cage in Atlanta. The sense that the exchange should be fair, that what you give and what you receive should bear some reasonable relationship to one another. The gods are invoked to give the law authority, but the content of the law, the moral substance, pre-exists the gods. It grows from the same ancient soil as the monkey's outrage at the cucumber. It grows from our nature as social animals who have learned over millions of years that fairness is not just a preference, but a necessity. There is one more dimension of the Hammurabi Code that deserves our attention because it speaks directly to the complexity of ancient moral thinking and resists the temptation to reduce ancient people to simple caricatures of brutality. Within the Code of Hammurabi, there are provisions that are genuinely protective of the vulnerable. Law 138, for example, requires a man who wishes to divorce a wife who has borne him no children to return her dowry and give her an additional sum of silver. Law 148 states that if a man's wife falls ill and he wishes to take a second wife, he may not divorce the first. He must maintain and support her for as long as she lives. Law 175 establishes that the children of a free person and a slave can be free upon the death of the father if he has acknowledged them. These provisions suggest a legal system that, while deeply patriarchal and hierarchical, was also grappling, genuinely and in detail, with the obligations of the powerful toward those who depended on them. Similarly, Law 5 of the Code of Hammurabi states that if a judge makes an erroneous judgment and it can be proven, he must pay 12 times the fine he imposed on the case's loser, be publicly removed from his judgeship, and never be permitted to sit in judgment again. A judge who abuses his authority faces devastating personal consequences. This is not just a rule. It is a statement about the accountability of those who hold power. Even in a society where power is highly stratified, there is an acknowledgement that power comes with obligation and that the corruption of justice is among the most serious wrongs a person can commit. And in the Code of Ur-Nammu, beyond the silver for injury provisions we already examined, there are laws that address false accusation. If a man accuses another man of certain crimes and the accusation cannot be proven, the accuser faces punishment. The principle here, the presumption that false accusation is itself a serious wrong, and that an unproven accusation carries no legal weight, is one that echoes through legal history all the way to the modern presumption of innocence in criminal law. These ancient codes were not simple. They were not just lists of punishments. They were attempts, flawed, hierarchical, embedded in social systems that would horrify us today, but genuine attempts to think through what it means to live in a society governed by rules rather than by the naked power of whoever happened to be strongest at any given moment. And in that effort, they were doing something that had never been done before in human history. They were making the moral imagination public, legible, and in principle binding on everyone within reach of the stone or the clay tablet. That is an act of profound moral courage, and it is, in its deepest structure, continuous with everything we have been exploring tonight. Now, let us take a slow breath. Let the weight of these ancient stones settle for a moment. And then let us do something even older, even stranger, even more beautiful. Let us travel to Egypt. Let us stand at the entrance to the afterlife. Let us watch the weighing of a human heart. Part 4. Ma'at and the weight of the heart. There is a scene described in the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead, a collection of funerary texts, spells, and rituals that was used throughout ancient Egyptian civilization for more than 1500 years, from roughly 1650 BCE onward, a scene so striking, so philosophically sophisticated, so morally rich that it has seized the imagination of everyone who has encountered it, from ancient Egyptian priests to modern Jungian psychologists to anyone who has ever looked up at the night sky and wondered whether the way they have lived their life will ultimately mean anything at all. The scene is called the weighing of the heart. In Egyptian, the ceremony is sometimes referred to as the weighing in the Hall of Two Truths, and it takes place, according to the ancient texts, in the moments immediately after death, in the great hall of Osiris, the god of the dead, the god of resurrection, the lord of the underworld, deep in the realm the Egyptians called the Duat, the land of the dead. Let me describe it to you. The deceased, you, in this scenario, having just died, is led into the Hall of Truth by the god Anubis, the jackal-headed deity who serves as the guide of souls and the guardian of the dead. The hall is immense and luminous. 42 divine judges sit in rows along the walls, each one responsible for assessing a specific category of wrongdoing, a specific way in which a human life can fail morally. These 42 assessors are ancient beings, cosmic in their authority. At the center of the hall stands a great set of scales, a balance, perfectly poised, its two golden pans hanging level in the air. On one side of the scales, Anubis places a feather. This is not just any feather. It is the feather of Ma'at, the white ostrich plume that symbolizes truth, justice, balance, and cosmic order. Ma'at herself is often depicted as a goddess, a woman wearing this feather on her head, though she is in some ways less a deity than a principle. She is the ground of existence. She is the force that keeps the cosmos from collapsing into chaos. She is what makes the sun rise and set, what makes the seasons turn, what makes the Nile flood at the proper time. She is right relationship between human beings, between humans and the natural world, between the visible world and the divine order that underlies it. On the other side of the scales, Anubis places your heart, your literal heart. In ancient Egyptian thought, the heart was not merely a pump. It was the seat of consciousness, memory, emotion, and moral character. Everything you had ever thought, felt, decided, said, and done was encoded in your heart. Your heart was, in the most complete and unerring sense possible, a record of your life. It was you, not your name, not your reputation, not the image you presented to the world, but the actual accumulated truth of every private moment, every choice made in darkness, every time you helped, and every time you looked away. And now, in the Hall of Truths, your heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, against the absolute standard of right relationship, truth, and justice. In the Egyptian texts, the deceased is required to recite what is called the negative confession, sometimes also called the Declaration of Innocence. Before the 42 divine judges, the deceased declares, one by one, the wrongdoings they have not committed. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not told lies. I have not caused suffering. I have not been covetous. I have not acted with violence. I have not committed fraud. I have not condemned a person unjustly. I have not been impatient. I have not been hot-tempered. I have not been deaf to words of truth. I have not polluted the water. I have not been an eavesdropper. One by one, through all 42 declarations, the deceased asserts their innocence. And all of this, every word, every claim, every moment of a lived life is weighed in the balance. If the heart is lighter than the feather of Ma'at, if the life lived was one of truth, justice, compassion, right relationship, and moral integrity, then the deceased passes into the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, a realm of eternal peace and beauty. If the heart is heavier than the feather, if the scales tip under the accumulated weight of dishonesty, cruelty, selfishness, injustice, exploitation, and harm, then a creature waits nearby. It is called the Amit, the devourer, depicted as a composite monster with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, three of the most dangerous animals in the Egyptian world. Amit devours the heavy heart, and the soul ceases to exist, condemned not to hellfire but to obliteration, to the second death from which there is no return. This is one of the most extraordinary moral documents in the history of human civilization, and I want to sit with it for a while because there is so much here that is worth examining slowly. The first thing to notice is the nature of the standard. The heart is not weighed against a list of religious observances. It is not weighed against how many times you attended temple, or how correctly you performed the rituals, or whether you gave the right offerings to the right gods at the right times. Those things mattered in ancient Egyptian religion, certainly, but in the weighing of the heart, the standard is ma'at, and ma'at is not a ritual standard, it is an ethical one. Look at the negative confession. The 42 declarations cover theft, violence, lies, fraud, cruelty, causing suffering, polluting water, cheating in business, being unjust in judgment. They cover treatment of the vulnerable, the poor, the weak, the hungry. They cover private behavior, the things done in secret that no one else saw. They cover inner states, impatience, anger, greed, envy. The standard is not orthodoxy. The standard is how you actually treated other living beings and the world around you. This is, in the deepest sense, a moral rather than a religious standard. And the remarkable thing is that it has a universal quality that transcends the specifics of Egyptian theology. Substitute the names. Replace Osiris with whatever name your tradition uses for divine justice. Replace Ma'at with whatever your tradition calls the ground of goodness, and the essential structure remains. Did your life tilt the scales toward truth or toward falsehood? Toward compassion or toward cruelty? Toward justice or toward exploitation? The second thing to notice is the radical democracy of the weighing. There is no exception for pharaohs. There is no exception for priests. There is no exception for the wealthy, the powerful, the celebrated, or the well-connected. The heart is weighed in private before divine judges who cannot be bribed and cannot be deceived. What you actually are, not what you claim to be, not what others believed of you, but what your heart actually contains, that is what is measured. This was a genuinely revolutionary moral claim in the ancient world. We saw in Hammurabi's code a legal system tiered by social class, where the same injury received different treatment depending on whether you were a noble, a commoner, or a slave. And this was the norm throughout the ancient world, as it has been throughout most of human history. Justice was calibrated to power. The stronger you were, the better your outcomes. But in the Hall of Two Truths, there is no such calibration. The feather of Ma'at is a fixed standard, absolute, unyielding, utterly indifferent to social rank. The pharaoh's heart and the slave's heart are weighed in the same balance. This is not just a theological belief. This is a moral statement of immense power. The statement that underneath all human hierarchies, underneath all the categories of status and wealth and power that human societies construct, there is a deeper order in which What matters is not what you had, but how you lived. The third thing to notice is what Ma'at tells us about the ancient Egyptian understanding of the cosmos. Ma'at is not just a moral standard, she is a cosmological principle. She is what keeps reality coherent. And the implication of this is profound. In the ancient Egyptian worldview, acting justly and truthfully is not merely an obligation imposed from outside. It is an alignment with the deepest structure of reality itself. The universe runs on Ma'at. The sun rises because Ma'at is maintained. The Nile floods at the right time because Ma'at is maintained. And when human beings act with injustice, with cruelty, with deceit, they are not merely breaking a rule. They are, in some small but real way, working against the fabric of existence. They are introducing chaos, the opposite of Ma'at, the force the Egyptians called Isfet, into a cosmos that depends on order. This is a remarkably sophisticated philosophical framework, and what it points toward is a vision of morality that is not arbitrary, not contingent, not merely a matter of social convention or divine command. In this vision, morality is woven into the structure of the cosmos. Goodness is real as gravity, as real as the orbit of the earth around the sun. And to live well is not just to follow rules, but to come into alignment with a truth that is older than any god, older than any civilization, older than human consciousness itself. Does that not resonate with what we found at the beginning of our exploration tonight? If the Capuchin monkey's rage at the cucumber is an echo of some deep evolutionary truth about the necessity of fairness, if that outrage is not learned but inscribed in the biology of social animals, then perhaps what the ancient Egyptians were reaching toward in their vision of Ma'at was not so far from what modern evolutionary biology is discovering. Perhaps there is, underlying both the biological and the spiritual understanding, a single deep truth that fairness, truth, and right relationship are not human inventions. They are features of the kind of universe that can produce and sustain life at all. Now, let us come to the concept of Ma'at in a broader sense, because it is richer and more multidimensional than the weighing of the heart alone captures. The word Ma'at, sometimes transliterated as Ma'at, is one of the most ancient concepts in Egyptian religion and philosophy. It appears in texts from the Old Kingdom, the earliest period of unified Egyptian civilization, dating back to roughly 2700 BCE. The hieroglyph for Ma'at is a woman seated or standing, with a single white ostrich feather on her head, sometimes holding a scepter or an ankh, the symbol of life. Ma'at encompasses a range of interrelated meanings. It means truth, in the sense of factual accuracy and honest speech. It means justice, in the sense of fair treatment and equitable distribution. It means balance, in the sense of harmony between opposing forces. It means right order, in the sense of everything being in its proper place, performing its proper function at the proper time. And it means cosmic harmony, the alignment of the human world with the divine structure of the universe. The opposite of Ma'at is Isfet, chaos, injustice, disorder, falsehood, imbalance. Isfet is not simply evil in a moralistic sense. It is the disintegration of right relationship, the state in which things are out of alignment, in which the proper order has been disrupted, in which the connections that sustain life have been broken. One of the pharaoh's most important ritual and political functions in the ancient Egyptian conception of kingship was to uphold Ma'at. The pharaoh was not simply a political ruler. He was, in his official ideology, the guarantor of cosmic order, the living link between the human world and the divine structure that sustained it. When a pharaoh performed the rituals correctly, administered justice fairly, protected the weak, maintained honest weights and measures in the markets, ensured the proper functioning of the irrigation systems, and led Egypt with wisdom and integrity, he was maintaining Ma'at. He was keeping the cosmos coherent. When a pharaoh failed in these duties, when he became corrupt, unjust, or negligent, he was allowing Isfe to creep in, and the consequences were understood to be not just political but cosmic. A pharaoh who violated Ma'at risked the chaos of failed floods, failed harvests, disease, military defeat, not as divine punishment in a simple transactional sense, but as the natural consequence of a cosmos thrown out of alignment. This is a sophisticated theory of the relationship between ethics, politics, and nature. And it has fascinating resonances with modern thinking about environmental ethics and ecological responsibility. The idea that how human beings treat each other and their world has consequences that ripple outward into the natural systems they depend on. In the spiritual practice of ordinary Egyptians, Ma'at was not just an abstract principle, it was a lived commitment. To live in Ma'at, to practice Ma'at, was to strive in every daily interaction and decision to be aligned with truth, fairness, and right relationship. It was an active orientation toward honesty in speech, fairness in commerce, compassion toward the suffering, and restraint of the impulse toward greed, cruelty, and exploitation. There is a text from the Middle Kingdom period of Egyptian history, roughly 2050 to 1650 BCE, known as the Maxims of Ptahhotep. It is one of the oldest works of wisdom literature in human history. The author, a vizier named Ptahhotep, who served under the 5th dynasty, offers advice to his son about how to live a good and meaningful life. And running through his maxims, like a golden thread, is the concept of Ma'at. He writes about the importance of listening, of being genuinely open to what others say rather than speaking only from the place of assumed knowledge. He writes about the danger of greed and the peace that comes from contentment. He writes about the importance of treating others according to their true quality, not according to their wealth or status. He writes about the dignity of silence and the skill of knowing when to speak and when to refrain. He writes with remarkable tenderness about the importance of gratitude, of recognizing the gifts of life and not taking them for granted. Let us linger for a moment on the 42 declarations of the negative confession, because they deserve more than a quick mention. These declarations, spoken before the divine court of Osiris, are in many ways the most complete moral document the ancient Egyptians left behind. They cover territory that goes far beyond what we might expect of an ancient civilization's ethical framework. Among the 42 declarations, the deceased affirms, "I have not stolen from the fields. I have not caused pain to others. I have not withheld milk from children. I have not driven cattle from their pastures. I have not snared birds in the sacred thickets. I have not caught fish with false bait. I have not stopped up running water. I have not turned back the tide. I have not extinguished the flame when it should burn. I have not been neglectful of the days of meat offerings. Notice what this list includes. Notice its range. There is theft, yes, and violence, yes. But there is also environmental harm, the pollution of water, the misuse of natural resources, the disturbance of the natural world. There is harm to animals, driving cattle from their pastures, snaring birds in sacred places. There is harm to children, withholding milk, the most foundational nourishment, from those who depend on it. The moral scope of the negative confession is breathtaking. It covers not just transactions between adult humans of roughly equal standing, but the full web of relationships that a human being inhabits, relationships with children, with animals, with the natural world, with sacred time and sacred practice. And consider this. When the ancient Egyptians said, "I have not stopped up running water," they were articulating something that we in the modern world are only beginning to relearn, that the health of the natural world is a moral responsibility, not merely a practical one. That how we treat the rivers, the land, the creatures we share the earth with, this too is weighed in the balance. This too is measured against the feather. There is also something deeply striking about the declaration, "I have not been an eavesdropper." In a list of the most serious moral violations a person can commit, theft, violence, murder, fraud, cruelty, eavesdropping appears. Why? Because in the ancient Egyptian moral framework, violating the privacy and the trust of another person, even without direct harm, even without theft or physical injury, is a moral wrong. It is a violation of right relationship. It is a form of taking what belongs to another, their private words, their unguarded thoughts, their inner life. The inclusion of this declaration suggests a moral sophistication about the nature of privacy, trust, and consent that is startlingly modern. It suggests that the ancient Egyptians understood something we sometimes forget, that morality is not only about preventing the grossest harms, it is about the quality of presence and respect we bring to all our relationships, including the quiet ones, the small ones, the ones no one else will ever see or know about. This brings us back one final time to the weighing itself. The heart is not weighed for its grand gestures. It is not weighed only for its greatest cruelties or its most spectacular kindnesses. It is weighed in its entirety, the accumulated weight of all the tiny moments of choice that make up a human life. The moment when you could have listened and chose not to. The moment when you could have been honest and chose the comfortable lie. The moment when someone needed something from you and you decided quietly that it was not your problem. These are the things that weigh on the heart, not because any single one of them is catastrophic, but because life is made of these moments, and the shape of a life is determined by which way those moments tilt over and over again across the years. None of this is specifically religious in the narrow sense. It is profoundly ethical. It is profoundly human. And it is, in its underlying logic, profoundly aligned with the deepest moral intuitions we have been tracing throughout this episode, the intuitions that show up in a furious Capuchin monkey, in the silver for a tooth laws of Ur-Nammu, and now in the white feather of Ma'at, trembling in the balance of the scale of divine judgment. What all of these traditions share, from the evolutionary biology of fairness to the ancient Sumerian code to the Egyptian vision of cosmic justice, is the recognition that morality is not an imposition on life. It is an expression of what life, at its deepest level, is. We are social creatures. We cannot survive alone. We need each other. And because we need each other, how we treat each other matters, not just practically, not just politically, not just legally, but in some fundamental way that touches the very nature of what we are and what the world is. This is the ancient wisdom that First Beliefs is dedicated to recovering, not as a historical curiosity, not as a source of theological argument, but as living guidance, guidance that is perhaps more urgently needed now than ever. Part 5. Synthesis and Reflection, the thread that runs through all of it. We have traveled a long way tonight. Let us take a moment to rest here in this final part of our journey and let the threads we have been weaving come together. We began with a question: did morality come before religion? And we found through the evidence of evolutionary biology and animal behavior that the answer is almost certainly yes, at least in the sense that the deep emotional and behavioral roots of moral intuition are older than any human religion, older than human language itself. The sense of fairness, the sensitivity to inequity, the impulse toward reciprocity and cooperation, these are features of the social animal, shaped by millions of years of evolution. They are in the monkey's body and in your body. They are in the architecture of your nervous system before you ever heard a word of any sacred text. This does not diminish religion. If anything, it elevates it. Because what this means is that the great religious and wisdom traditions of humanity, including the ancient Egyptian tradition of Ma'at, including the Mesopotamian legal traditions of Ur-Nammu and Hammurabi, including the traditions of every civilization that has tried to articulate what it means to live well, were not inventing morality from scratch. They were doing something harder and more beautiful than that. They were taking a deep, embodied, pre-linguistic moral instinct and translating it into language, into story, into law, into metaphor, into ritual, into architecture, into everything that makes human civilization what it is. They were taking the monkey's outrage at the cucumber and turning it into the feather of Ma'at. They were taking the evolutionary drive toward reciprocity and turning it into 282 laws engraved in black basalt. They were taking the animal instinct for fairness and turning it into the Declaration of Innocence, spoken by trembling souls in the luminous hall of Osiris. That is astonishing. That is, in a very real sense, what civilization is. And what is even more astonishing is that these different traditions, arising in different places and different times, looking at the same deep human material through different lenses, consistently arrive at a similar core insight. Let us name that insight clearly. Fairness is not optional. Justice is not arbitrary. The way we treat each other matters, not just to us, but to something larger, to society, to the cosmos, to the underlying order of things. Ur-Nammu understood this. He put it in terms of silver and compensation. If you have damaged someone, you owe them repair, not revenge, repair. Hammurabi understood it differently. He put it in terms of equivalence and proportionality. The scales of justice must balance. What was taken must be answered with equal weight. The ancient Egyptians understood it differently still. They put it in terms of ma'at, the feather of cosmic truth against which every heart is measured. The standard is not religious performance. The standard is the actual quality of your relationship to truth, to justice, to the people around you, to the living world. And Franz de Waal and Sarah Brosnan's Capuchin monkeys understood it in the only language they had available to them: the thrown cucumber, the rattled cage, the vocalization of pure indignation at a world that had, in the most practical and undeniable way possible, failed to be fair. All of these are different languages for the same truth, and that truth has been present since before human beings existed to put it into words. Now, let us turn this inward for a moment, because all of this history, all of this biology, all of this ancient wisdom, it is not just information, it is a mirror, it is an invitation. The weighing of the heart is, in one sense, a belief about the afterlife, but in another sense, and perhaps the more important sense, it is a practice for the present life. It is an invitation to ask yourself right now, while you are still alive and still capable of choosing, how heavy is your heart? Not heavy with grief or sadness. Heaviness in that sense is simply part of being human, and there is no shame in it. But heavy with the kind of accumulated weight that Ma'at describes. Heavy with the times you chose deception over truth when truth was hard. Heavy with the times you took more than your share and did not look at the person you took it from. Heavy with the times the cry of someone in need reached you and you turned away. These questions are not meant to produce guilt. Guilt, unprocessed, is not a moral force. It is a paralysis. These questions are meant to produce reflection. And reflection, genuinely undertaken, produces what the ancient Egyptians would have recognized as alignment with Ma'at. The willingness to look clearly at your own life, to acknowledge where you have fallen short of your own deepest values, and to reorient, to come back into right relationship with truth, with other people, with the living world. This is a spiritual practice as ancient as the feather on the scale. The Code of Ur-Nammu offers us another practical teaching. Its underlying principle that justice means repair, not revenge, has deep implications for how we handle the wounds of our own lives. When we are wronged, the primal impulse is for the lex talionis, for equivalence, for the other person to hurt as much as we hurt. This is the Hammurabi in us, the ancient evolutionary demand that the scales balance. And it is not wrong, it is human. It is deeply biologically human, as the Capuchin monkeys remind us. But there is another possibility. There is the Ur-Nammu possibility. The possibility that what justice actually requires, what will actually restore balance, is not the equivalent suffering of the offender, but the actual repair of what was broken. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, That repair does not require the other person's suffering at all. It requires acknowledgement. It requires accountability. It requires some form of genuine restoration. And in personal terms, it requires the willingness to let the demand for revenge be released, not because what was done to you does not matter, but because what was done to you matters too much to leave you permanently organized around the wound. This is hard. It is some of the hardest inner work a human being can do. Every tradition we have examined tonight acknowledges this difficulty. The path of Ma'at is not easy. The willingness to choose restitution over revenge requires something from us that our evolutionary wiring did not easily provide. It requires what the ancient wisdom traditions call transcendence, not the denial of our nature, but the conscious, intentional choice to work with our nature in the direction of something larger. And finally, let us return to where we started, the deep question of whether morality is natural or divine, whether it was made by evolution or by God. And let us sit one more time with the possibility that this question contains a false opposition. In the ancient Egyptian worldview, Ma'at is not something added to the universe from outside. It is not a divine decree that contradicts or overrides nature. It is the principle that nature itself runs on. The cosmos is ordered by Ma'at, and that order expresses itself at every scale in the movement of the stars, in the flooding of the Nile, in the growth of wheat, in the fair exchange between two merchants in a marketplace, in the private decisions of a single human heart in the dark. If we take this seriously as a philosophical framework, not necessarily as a theological claim, but as a way of understanding the world, then the question of whether morality is natural or divine dissolves. Because in this framework, the natural and the divine are not in opposition. The deepest patterns of nature are the expression of the divine. And the moral instincts embedded in the body of a social animal by millions of years of evolution are not accidental. They are not merely useful. They are a participation, however unconscious and however incomplete, in the same deep order that the ancient Egyptians named Ma'at, the principle that makes the cosmos coherent and makes life possible. This is what First Beliefs is about, not the performance of religion, not the comfort of easy answers, not the reassurance that everything is fine and we do not need to look carefully at anything. First Beliefs is about the willingness to go back, to go all the way back to the deepest roots of what we are, and to find there not emptiness, not chaos, not the meaningless clash of blind forces, but something that deserves, in the broadest and most careful sense, to be called sacred. The monkey's outrage at the unfair exchange. The king who inscribes on clay the obligation to repair. The feather poised against the heart. These are not primitive superstitions to be outgrown. These are first beliefs, the oldest and most durable intimations that something matters, that how we live matters, that the quality of our attention to each other, to the truth, to the world, this is what we are here for. And that, perhaps, is enough. Thank you for spending this time with First Beliefs. If you have made it to the end of this episode, you have traveled through millions of years of evolutionary history, through the river civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia, and into the luminous Hall of Two Truths in the Egyptian underworld. That is quite a journey. If this episode has given you something, a new idea, a moment of peace, a question that will linger with you into tomorrow, then please take a moment right now to subscribe to First Beliefs on YouTube. Your subscription is how this channel grows, and it is how these conversations about ancient wisdom, spiritual knowledge, and the deep roots of what it means to be human reach more people who are looking for exactly this kind of nourishment. Leave a comment below telling us which part of tonight's journey resonated most with you. Was it the Capuchin monkey experiment? The contrast between Hammurabi and Ur-Nammu? The weighing of the heart? Or perhaps a question the episode raised for you that you want to explore further? Your comments shape the direction of this community, and every message is genuinely read and considered. We will meet again soon in another deep dive into the sacred, the ancient, the overlooked, and the profoundly relevant. Until then, may your heart be light. May you walk in Ma'at. And may the wisdom of those who came before us continue to illuminate the path ahead. This has been First Beliefs. Rest well.